In the scorching heat of Nevada's most desolate stretch of desert, where the sun beats down mercilessly and the nearest neighbor lives 40 miles away, stood a cabin that nobody wanted. For 3 years, it had been listed for sale at rock-bottom prices, yet not a single buyer had shown interest. Real estate agents whispered among themselves about the cursed property, and locals avoided even driving past it. What they didn't know was that this forgotten piece of land was about to change one man's life forever, in ways that would challenge everything he believed about luck, destiny, and the secrets that the desert keeps buried beneath its unforgiving surface. The cabin belonged to the estate of Harold Wickham, an eccentric hermit who had died alone in 2019, leaving behind nothing but debt and a property that seemed more burden than blessing. The structure itself was barely standing, with walls that groaned in the desert wind and a roof that leaked sand instead of keeping it out. The asking price had dropped from $50,000 to $30,000, then to $15,000, yet still no takers emerged. Insurance companies refused to cover it, banks wouldn't finance it, and even the most desperate house flippers took one look and walked away shaking their heads. But Marcus Thompson wasn't most people. A 34-year-old ranch hand from Montana who had spent the last 15 years working cattle drives and seasonal jobs, Marcus had saved every penny he could scrape together. When his last employer sold the ranch and left him unemployed, Marcus found himself with $8,000 to his name and nowhere to call home. That's when he stumbled across the listing for Wickham's cabin online, hidden deep in a real estate website's bargain basement section. The property photos were deliberately unflattering. Shot in harsh midday light, they showed a ramshackle structure that looked more like a movie set for a post-apocalyptic western than an actual home. The description was equally discouraging, mentioning the lack of running water, unreliable electricity from solar panels that barely functioned, and the complete absence of cell phone reception. Most concerning was the final line that mentioned unusual geological activity in the area, though it provided no further explanation. Marcus made the drive from Montana to Nevada in his beat-up Ford pickup, towing a trailer with everything he owned. The real estate agent, Sarah Martinez, had tried to talk him out of the viewing 3 times during their phone conversations. She painted a picture of isolation so complete that it bordered on punishment, warning him about rattlesnakes, scorpions, and the psychological toll of absolute solitude. But Marcus had spent most of his adult life in remote locations, and solitude didn't frighten him the way it might others. When he first laid eyes on the property, Marcus understood why nobody wanted it. The cabin sat at the bottom of a natural depression in the landscape, surrounded by jagged rock formations that created an almost amphitheater-like setting. The nearest paved road was 12 miles away, accessible only by a dirt track that would become impassable during the rare desert storms. The silence was so complete that it felt oppressive, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. Sarah Martinez met him at the property with obvious reluctance, constantly checking her watch and making comments about needing to return to civilization before dark. She rushed through the tour, pointing out cracked foundations, outdated wiring, and a well that may or may not still produce water. The interior was a study in neglect, with furniture covered in dust sheets and personal belongings scattered as if Harold Wickham had simply vanished mid-activity. What struck Marcus most was not the cabin's obvious flaws, but something else entirely. In one of the back rooms, he noticed that the wooden floorboards didn't quite match the rest of the house. While most of the flooring was original pine, weathered and worn smooth by decades of use, this particular section appeared newer, though still old enough to have developed its own patina. When he mentioned this to Sarah, she dismissed it as probably a repair job that Wickham had done at some point. Marcus made an offer of $7,000 that same day, nearly his entire savings. Sarah initially refused to present such a low offer, but Marcus persisted, explaining that it was genuinely all he could afford. To everyone's surprise, the estate accepted immediately, so quickly that Sarah wondered aloud if they should have offered even less. The paperwork was completed within a week, and Marcus found himself the proud owner of the most unwanted property in Nevada. Moving in was an adventure in itself. Without proper road access, Marcus had to make multiple trips with his pickup to transport his belongings. He set up a basic camp in the least damaged room while he assessed what repairs were most urgent. The solar panels, while ancient, did provide enough electricity for basic needs. The well, after some coaxing and the installation of a new pump, produced clean water with a slightly mineral taste that actually appealed to him. During his first week, Marcus focused on making the cabin habitable. He patched the roof, secured loose boards, and cleared out decades of accumulated debris. The isolation that had terrified potential buyers felt liberating to him. After years of bunkhouses and shared quarters, having his own space, however humble, felt like luxury. He established routines, rising with the sun and working until the desert heat became unbearable in the afternoon. It was during his second week that Marcus first noticed the sounds. Initially, he attributed the occasional groaning and creaking noises to the cabin settling in the temperature extremes of desert climate. But some of the sounds seemed to come from beneath the floor, particularly in that back room where he had noticed the mismatched boards. When he mentioned this during a rare phone call to his sister back in Montana, she joked that he had bought a haunted house and maybe the ghost of Harold Wickham was trying to communicate. Marcus wasn't superstitious by nature, but the desert had a way of making even rational people consider possibilities they might normally dismiss. The sounds became more frequent, always occurring in the same area of the cabin. Always at night when the temperature differential between day and night caused materials to contract. But they followed no pattern that Marcus could discern, sometimes absent for days, other times occurring multiple times in a single evening. His curiosity finally got the better of him on a particularly quiet Thursday evening. Using a flashlight and a pry bar he had brought from Montana, Marcus carefully examined the floorboards in the back room. What he discovered confirmed his earlier suspicions. While the boards were old, they had definitely been removed and replaced at some point. The nail holes didn't quite line up with the supporting joists, and the wood stain was slightly different, though both had aged to a similar color. Working carefully to avoid damaging the boards unnecessarily, Marcus began to lift them one by one. Underneath, instead of the dirt floor he expected, he found another wooden surface. Someone had built a false floor, creating a hidden space between the original foundation and the visible interior. The craftsmanship was decent but not professional, suggesting that Harold Wickham himself had done the work. As Marcus removed more boards, he realized that the hidden compartment was larger than he had initially thought, extending under most of the back room. Using his flashlight to peer into the space, he could see that it contained something, though the shadows made it impossible to determine what. The air that rose from the opening carried a musty smell, tinged with something metallic that he couldn't immediately identify. Marcus constructed a makeshift ladder using scrap wood and carefully lowered himself into the hidden space. The compartment was about 4 feet deep, with rough wooden walls and a dirt floor. As his eyes adjusted to the flashlight beam, he saw that the space contained dozens of objects wrapped in what appeared to be old canvas and oilcloth. Some were small enough to hold in one hand, others were larger and heavier, requiring 2 hands to lift. The first package he unwrapped contained rocks. But these weren't ordinary desert stones. They were heavy for their size, with a distinctive yellowish glint that made Marcus's heart race. Having grown up in Montana mining country, he recognized gold or when he saw it. But this wasn't raw or straight from the ground. These specimens had been processed, refined to concentrate the precious metal content. Package after package revealed similar contents. Some contained raw gold nuggets, others held refined gold in various forms. There were old glass jars filled with gold dust, cloth bags containing processed flakes, and even several crude gold bars that appeared to have been melted down and cast in improvised molds. As Marcus continued his inventory, the scope of Harold Wickham's secret became clear. This wasn't a small personal collection or a hobby prospector's modest findings. This was a substantial cache of gold, hidden away for reasons Marcus could only guess at. By dawn, Marcus had removed and cataloged everything from the hidden compartment. His dining room table groaned under the weight of Wickham's secret treasure. Using a small scale he had brought for measuring coffee, Marcus began the painstaking process of weighing and documenting his discovery. The numbers were staggering. Even with his limited knowledge of current gold prices, Marcus could tell that he was looking at a fortune that would change his life completely. But with the excitement came questions that troubled him. Where had Harold Wickham obtained this gold? The man had lived as a hermit in the desert, with no apparent source of income beyond a small pension. Had he discovered a rich deposit somewhere in the surrounding desert? Was he involved in illegal mining operations? Or worse, had the gold been stolen from legitimate operations and hidden away until the heat died down? Marcus spent the next several days researching everything he could find about Harold Wickham and the history of mining in the area. What he discovered was a patchwork of rumors, speculation, and dead ends. Wickham had arrived in Nevada in 1987, purchasing the property when it was even more remote and inaccessible than it was now. Neighbors from that era, the few that Marcus could track down through online searches and phone calls, remembered him as a secretive man who rarely came to town and never spoke about his past or his means of support. The geological surveys of the area were equally puzzling. While Nevada was certainly mining country, with a rich history of gold and silver extraction, the immediate area around the cabin had never been considered particularly promising. Several small-scale prospecting operations had tried their luck over the decades, but none had found anything worth developing commercially. If Wickham had discovered a rich deposit, he had managed to keep it completely secret for over 30 years. As Marcus pondered his next move, he realized that he faced a complex web of legal and ethical considerations. If the gold had been obtained legally, then, as the property owner, he likely had legitimate claim to it. But if it had been stolen or obtained through illegal means, keeping it could make him an accessory after the fact. Even more concerning was the question of whether anyone else knew about Wickham's secret. Had the old hermit confided in anyone before his death? Were there partners or co-conspirators who might come looking for their share? The isolation that had initially attracted Marcus to the property now felt potentially dangerous. If word of his discovery leaked out, the remote location that protected his privacy could also make him vulnerable to those who might decide that taking the gold by force was easier than pursuing legal remedies. Marcus began to vary his routines, keeping watch for any signs that he was being observed, and he moved the gold to a new hiding place that he created in the cabin's cellar. His research into Harold Wickham's background eventually led him to a breakthrough. In the archives of the Nevada State Library, Marcus found a newspaper clipping from 1986 that mentioned Wickham in connection with a mining dispute. The article was brief and the details were vague, but it suggested that Wickham had been involved in a legal battle over mineral rights somewhere in the northern part of the state. The case had apparently been settled out of court, with all parties signing confidentiality agreements. This discovery prompted Marcus to dig deeper into Nevada's mining records. What he found was a complex history of claim disputes, corporate takeovers, and legal battles that had raged through the 1980s as gold prices fluctuated and new extraction technologies made previously unviable deposits profitable. Wickham's name appeared in several documents, always in connection with a company called Desert Crown Mining, which had folded in 1987 amid allegations of improper bookkeeping and missing assets. The timeline was beginning to make sense. Desert Crown Mining had dissolved in early 1987, and Harold Wickham had purchased the cabin property later that same year. The company's financial records, what few Marcus could access through public filings, showed significant discrepancies between the amount of gold they claimed to have extracted and the amount they had sold to refineries. The difference was substantial enough to attract the attention of both state regulators and the IRS. But the investigation had been closed without criminal charges when the company's assets were liquidated to pay creditors. Marcus realized that he was likely looking at the missing gold from Desert Crown Mining. Wickham had somehow managed to divert a portion of the company's production before the collapse, hiding it away in his desert cabin until the statute of limitations ran out and the heat died down. It was a patient man's crime, requiring decades of discipline to resist the temptation to sell the gold and enjoy the proceeds. But this realization created new problems for Marcus. While the statute of limitations for theft had long since expired, there might still be civil liability issues. The creditors who had been shortchanged when Desert Crown Mining folded might have legitimate claims to the gold if they could prove its origin. More concerning was the possibility that there were other players involved, co-conspirators who had been waiting for Wickham to make his move and who might now turn their attention to Marcus. As these thoughts weighed on his mind, Marcus noticed that he was no longer alone in the desert. Twice in the past week, he had spotted dust clouds on the horizon that suggested vehicles traveling the rough desert roads. While it was possible that these were innocent travelers or even lost tourists, the timing seemed suspicious. The isolation that had protected Wickham's secret for 30 years was now working against Marcus. His concerns were validated one evening when he spotted headlights approaching the cabin long after sunset. Marcus quickly extinguished his own lights and watched from a darkened window as a pickup truck slowly circled the property before parking about 100 yards away. Two figures emerged and stood talking quietly, occasionally pointing toward the cabin. After about 20 minutes, they returned to their vehicle and drove away, but Marcus noticed that they took a different route than the one they had used to arrive. The next morning, Marcus found boot prints around the cabin's perimeter and evidence that someone had examined his pickup truck and trailer. They had also checked the cabin's exterior, looking at windows and doors as if assessing potential entry points. Most disturbing was the discovery of small piles of stones placed at strategic locations around the property, markers that could be used to coordinate surveillance or plan an approach. Marcus realized that his time for making decisions was running short. Someone else clearly knew about the gold, and they were conducting reconnaissance to determine the best way to retrieve it. His options were limited. He could contact law enforcement, but that would inevitably lead to questions about how he had discovered the gold and whether he had any legal right to it. He could attempt to sell the gold quickly and quietly, but finding buyers for such a large quantity without attracting attention would be nearly impossible. Or he could try to relocate both himself and the gold to a more secure location, though transporting such valuable cargo would carry its own risks. The decision was made for him the following night. Marcus was awakened by the sound of vehicles approaching, multiple engines running without headlights. Through his window, he could see at least 3 trucks positioning themselves around the cabin, their occupants clearly coordinating their movements through radio communication. These were not casual thieves or opportunistic criminals. This was a professional operation, planned and executed with military precision. Marcus had prepared for this possibility by creating multiple hiding places for the gold and establishing an escape route through the cabin's back rooms that would allow him to reach his pickup truck without being seen from the front of the property. As voices outside began discussing the best approach to the cabin, Marcus grabbed a backpack containing the most valuable and portable pieces of gold and slipped out through a window he had modified for just this purpose. Moving carefully through the darkness, using rock formations for cover, Marcus made his way to his pickup truck. The intruders had apparently not considered the possibility that he might try to escape by vehicle, focusing their attention on surrounding the cabin itself. Marcus was able to start his truck and begin driving without headlights, using his intimate knowledge of the property's terrain to navigate in the darkness. But his escape was short-lived. As he reached the main dirt road that led away from the property, headlights blazed to life behind him, and he realized that the intruders had positioned a blocking vehicle precisely to prevent this type of getaway. A high-speed chase through desert terrain at night was not something Marcus had ever imagined himself involved in, but survival instincts took over as he pushed his pickup truck to its limits on the rough road. The pursuit continued for several miles, with Marcus using every trick he had learned during years of driving in remote areas to maintain his lead. His pursuers were clearly unfamiliar with the terrain, their heavier vehicles struggling with rocks and gullies that Marcus's lighter pickup navigated easily. When he finally reached the paved highway, Marcus had opened up enough of a lead to disappear into the sparse traffic of the desert interstate. He drove through the night, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the cabin. As dawn broke over the Nevada desert, Marcus found himself in a truck stop parking lot in Utah, surrounded by long-haul truckers and early-morning travelers who had no idea that the exhausted-looking cowboy at the next gas pump was carrying a fortune in gold in his backpack. Over coffee and a truck stop breakfast, Marcus tried to process what had happened and plan his next moves. The gold in his backpack represented only a small fraction of what he had discovered in the cabin, but it was still worth more money than he had ever dreamed of possessing. The question now was how to convert it into usable funds without attracting the attention of either law enforcement or the people who had just tried to rob him. His first priority was establishing a secure base of operations far from Nevada. Marcus used cash to rent a small apartment in Salt Lake City under a false name, paying several months in advance to avoid questions about employment or references. He then began the careful process of researching gold dealers and refineries, looking for those who asked fewer questions and operated with more discretion than the major commercial buyers. What Marcus discovered was an entire underground economy built around precious metals transactions. From coin dealers who specialized in estate sales to refineries that catered to small-scale miners, there were numerous legitimate businesses that could help him convert his gold into cash without triggering the reporting requirements that govern larger transactions. The key was patience and spreading the sales across multiple buyers to avoid concentrating attention. Over the course of several months, Marcus methodically sold portions of his gold cash. He developed relationships with dealers in different cities, never selling enough to any single buyer to raise suspicions. His story was carefully crafted and consistently told. He was liquidating his grandfather's coin collection and mineral specimens, selling them off gradually to supplement his income while he looked for steady work. The money accumulated slowly but steadily. Marcus opened bank accounts in different cities under his own name, making deposits that stayed below the thresholds that triggered automatic reporting to federal agencies. He learned about investment options, tax implications, and the legitimate ways that people built and preserved wealth. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus began planning for a future that extended beyond his next paycheck. But success brought new anxieties. Marcus found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering if his former pursuers had given up their search or were simply biding their time. He varied his routines, avoided establishing predictable patterns, and always kept a bag packed in case he needed to disappear quickly. The paranoia was exhausting, but it seemed like a reasonable price to pay for financial security. As his bank accounts grew, Marcus began to consider what kind of life he wanted to build with his newfound wealth. He could return to ranch work, but now as an owner rather than an employee. He could invest in real estate, businesses, or securities and live off the returns. Or he could simply travel, exploring places and experiences that had been impossible on a working cowboy's wages. The irony was not lost on him that Harold Wickham had died alone in the desert, surrounded by wealth he had never dared to enjoy. The old hermit had successfully hidden his treasure for 30 years, but what good had it done him? He had lived in poverty and isolation, denied himself the pleasures that money could buy, all to protect a secret that died with him. Marcus was determined not to repeat Wickham's mistake, but he also understood the forces that had shaped the old man's choices. The gold represented not just wealth, but also danger. Every dollar spent was a potential clue for those who might still be searching. Every purchase, every investment, every change in lifestyle carried the risk of exposure. As winter settled over Salt Lake City, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. He would return to Nevada, not to the cabin, which was certainly still being watched, but to the general area where he could conduct his own investigation into Harold Wickham's past and the people who had tried to rob him. He needed to understand the full scope of what he had stumbled into, and more importantly, he needed to determine whether the threat to his safety was ongoing or had passed. The research he conducted over the following months painted a picture of corruption and violence that extended far beyond a simple mining fraud. Desert Crown Mining had been connected to a network of companies and individuals involved in money laundering, drug trafficking, and other criminal enterprises. Harold Wickham had not been a simple thief, but rather a small player in a much larger criminal organization who had managed to disappear with a portion of their assets. The men who had come looking for the gold were not just former business associates seeking to recover stolen property. They were representatives of criminal interests who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their missing assets. Wickham's death had finally provided them with an opportunity to search for answers, but Marcus's discovery and escape had disrupted their plans. This knowledge was both terrifying and liberating for Marcus. On one hand, he was dealing with dangerous people who would not hesitate to use violence to recover what they considered their property. On the other hand, these same people could not pursue him through legal channels or enlist law enforcement assistance, since doing so would expose their own criminal activities. Marcus realized that his best protection was not hiding, but rather ensuring that the full truth about Desert Crown Mining and its associates became public knowledge. He began working with investigative journalists and law enforcement agencies, providing them with evidence about the criminal network while carefully avoiding any mention of the gold he had discovered. His goal was to generate enough legal pressure on his former pursuers that they would be too busy defending themselves to continue hunting for Wickham's treasure. The strategy worked better than Marcus had dared to hope. Within 6 months, federal investigations had resulted in multiple indictments and the dismantling of what remained of the Desert Crown mining network. Several of the men who had come to his cabin were arrested on unrelated charges, and the organization that had spent decades searching for their missing assets was scattered and broken. But Marcus's victory came with an unexpected consequence. As the criminal investigations progressed, federal agencies began taking a renewed interest in the original Desert Crown mining fraud. Cold case investigators started reviewing the company's financial records, looking for assets that might be recovered to compensate the victims of the original scheme. The cabin property, as Harold Wickham's last known residence, became a focus of their attention. Marcus watched from afar as federal agents searched the cabin and discovered the hidden compartment where he had found the gold. The fact that it was empty puzzled the investigators, who had expected to find evidence of Wickham's criminal activities. Their reports, which Marcus was able to access through Freedom of Information requests, speculated that the hidden space had once contained the missing Desert Crown mining assets, but that they had been removed at some point after Wickham's death. The official investigation concluded that person or persons unknown had discovered Wickham's cache and removed it, probably soon after his death when the property was being prepared for sale. The case was closed with a recommendation that any recovered assets be returned to the original victims of the Desert Crown mining fraud. But since no assets had been recovered, no further action was required. Marcus found himself in the clear legally, but the irony of the situation was not lost on him. The government investigators had been absolutely correct in their conclusions, except that they had no idea who the person or persons unknown actually were. Marcus was the beneficiary of a perfect crime, committed not by himself but by a dead man who had never lived to enjoy the fruits of his theft. With the threat of criminal pursuit eliminated and the legal investigations concluded, Marcus finally felt free to enjoy his wealth openly. He purchased a ranch in Montana, not far from where he had grown up, and began building the life he had always dreamed of. The gold continued to provide income as he sold portions of it through legitimate channels, paying taxes on the proceeds and building a documented history of his transactions. Years later, as Marcus sat on the porch of his ranch house watching the sun set over the mountains, he often thought about the chain of events that had brought him to this point. A cabin that nobody wanted had contained a treasure that had changed his life completely. Harold Wickham's paranoid secrecy had protected not just his own secret, but had also ensured that Marcus could claim the gold without legal complications. The desert still called to him occasionally, and Marcus would sometimes drive back to Nevada to visit the area where his adventure had begun. The cabin still stood, though it was now posted with federal no trespassing signs and had been stripped of anything valuable by souvenir hunters and scrap metal dealers. The isolation remained complete, the silence as profound as ever, but the mystery that had once lurked beneath its floorboards was gone forever. Marcus never spoke publicly about his discovery, maintaining the same secretive discretion that had served Harold Wickham so well. The gold dealers who had helped him convert his treasure into cash knew only that he was a rancher liquidating inherited assets. His banker knew only that he was a successful businessman with diverse income sources. His neighbors knew only that he was a hard-working cowboy who had somehow managed to buy his own spread and live comfortably. But sometimes, late at night when the wind howled across the Montana plains, Marcus would remember the sound of floorboards creaking in a desert cabin, and he would smile at the memory of the day when nobody's cabin became somebody's fortune. The desert had kept Harold Wickham's secret for 30 years, and now it was keeping Marcus's secret as well, buried beneath the endless silence of the Nevada wasteland where fortunes are made and lost, and where the only witnesses are the hawks circling overhead and the endless expanse of blue sky that sees everything and tells nothing.